My ex-wife stole my identity, threatened to keep our son, and then the judge's final ruling shocked everyone. It's amazing how one moment in your life can irrevocably shift its course. 4 years ago, I sat in a cramped, fluorescent-lit courthouse, penning my signature to finalize a divorce I never believed would happen. Even though there was a bitter flavor in my mouth as the judge handed down the final decree, I still felt a faint glimmer of optimism. After all, it was done. The conflict, the endless arguments, the mutual accusations, those were supposed to stay in the past, sealed with that divorce decree. I tried to tell myself that the worst had already happened. We had parted ways, and at least now, we'd both be free to build new, separate lives. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. My ex-wife, let's call her Tiffany, seemed perfectly amenable at first. Or maybe I was just eager to believe that we could rise above the rancor of a broken marriage for the sake of our son, Daniel, who was only 8 at the time. The custody arrangement assigned Tiffany as the primary parent since she lived in the same school district Daniel had always attended, while I received alternating weekends, summers, and holidays. I used to hang on that schedule with a resigned sort of hope, picturing the day Daniel would grow a bit older, and we could move to a 50-50 arrangement with less drama. But the truth is that Tiffany had other plans from the start, and that meant my illusions of a peaceful co-parenting setup quickly blew up in my face. Back then, I had already accepted a job transfer to a branch of my company located about 30 miles away from the small city we once called home. I managed to find a house closer to that new job, something with a nice big yard I hoped Daniel could enjoy on the weekends. I still remember how thrilled he had been the first time I showed him around. The old oak tree in the backyard was perfect for climbing, and I had this half-formed plan to install a basketball hoop out front. Maybe I was a hopeless optimist, but I really believed this house represented a fresh start, a second chance at personal happiness. And for a while, things were surprisingly cordial, considering the storm we'd just weathered. 4 years of separation, arguments, and tension. Tiffany had her life, I had mine. On paper, it all looked workable. Then, one day, I received a letter that changed everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon, about 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I got home late from work, my feet dragging from a day filled with back-to-back meetings, my mind split between exhaustion and the usual paternal guilt about only seeing Daniel on weekends. I opened the mailbox to find a crisp white envelope from a collection agency. Confusion flickered through me. It must be a mistake. I had no debts in collections, I was sure of that. Inside, I found a letter stating I was severely delinquent on a credit card account. My heart thudded painfully as my eyes scanned the lines, searching for the name of the company I supposedly owed. When I recognized the name of the store the card belonged to, my confusion only grew. I was adamant I had never applied for it. It didn't take much digging, about 15 minutes of rummaging through my personal records and credit history, to confirm that not only had I not opened this account, but there were 2 others also listing me as the primary cardholder. The addresses on the statements were Tiffany's. The purchases were made at her frequent haunts, a local cosmetics store, the grocery chain next to her apartment, even a couple of children's clothing shops I recognized from Daniel's old receipts. My hands actually shook as I flipped through the pages. The dread set in like a weight in my gut. I knew who was responsible, but I couldn't quite make myself believe she would do something like that. Our divorce had been messy, yes, but impersonating me on credit applications? It wasn't just petty. It was criminal. I wanted to call her immediately. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she'd opened them by mistake. But the red print threatening legal recourse and credit repercussions was staring me in the face. And there was no possible way this was just some silly mix-up. The betrayal stung deeper than I wanted to admit. In the days following the divorce, we had agreed, at least verbally, to keep Daniel's best interests front and center. The illusions of good faith co-parenting promptly evaporated as I stared at the evidence that she had stolen my identity. I spent that night crafting strategies in my head. Part of me wanted to rush over to her place the second I confirmed the fraud. Another part advised me to lock down my credit, call a lawyer, and refuse any conversation that wasn't mediated. Ultimately, I decided to try a direct face-to-face approach. I wanted to give her a chance to address it privately before I brought the police into it. At the time, I still believed in caution for Daniel's sake. The last thing I wanted was for him to see his parents at each other's throats, parading the family drama through a courtroom. Again, that Monday, I had to drop Daniel off after our scheduled weekend. I was usually greeted at the door by Tiffany's neutral or vaguely polite expression, kind of a silent thanks that I brought him back on time. This time, the tension crackled between us and she picked up on it. We exchanged minimal pleasantries before Daniel headed into the house to drop off his bag. Once he was out of earshot, I held up the collection letter, my voice quivering as I tried to keep it calm. "I know what you did. I started, not sure whether to raise my voice or keep it measured. There are credit card accounts in my name with your address. I got a notice from a collection agency. Her eyes flickered. For a brief moment, she looked genuinely frightened, as if the reality of what she had done was crashing into her. Then she composed herself. Tiffany was nothing if not adept at burying her emotions. "You must be mistaken," she said cold, her voice laced with indignation. "Why would I open credit cards in your name? I've got my own finances." I scoffed, too stunned to properly respond to her denial. "The statements are addressed to you. There's no way this is a coincidence." She crossed her arms. "Look, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have my own income. I don't need to steal from you." I felt something snap inside. I hated this unwelcome wave of anger that slammed through my body. "I'm going to the police if you don't pay them off and close them immediately," I said, my voice low, firm. "I don't want my credit destroyed because of you." Her face changed then. Less confusion, more cold, calculated resolve. "If you go to the police," she shot back, "I'll say you're a danger to Daniel. Don't think I won't keep him away from you. You can fight me in court again. You know I've done it before." Hearing those words stopped me cold. I felt nauseous, recalling how quickly she had once wrenched Daniel from my weekends after another disagreement. Back then, I had spent months battling it out in court just to enforce the basic visitation schedule, and the outcome had seen me gain some extra holiday time while still maintaining the original arrangement. Technically, I had won the legal scuffle, but it had been a punishing, stressful, and expensive ordeal. The memory of Daniel's confusion and heartbreak, not understanding why he couldn't see me, was enough to haunt me forever. But how many times was I supposed to let her hold our son over my head like some bargaining chip? For the moment, though, I backed off. "I'll talk to you later," I said hoarsely, turning away. I remember the smug set of her mouth, as if she had scored a victory. In a way, she had. I left feeling cornered, worried about the fallout for Daniel if I pressed charges. But I also knew that ignoring this would destroy my credit and probably give her permission to keep opening accounts in my name. Within the week, my resolution hardened. I didn't want my son to see me as a doormat, someone who tolerated being walked on out of fear. I also knew if Tiffany wasn't held accountable, she'd never stop. She'd see me as a perpetual source of extra funds. Or more frighteningly, she'd just keep using my identity whenever she wanted, piling up debt in my name with no intention of paying. That could cost me my financial future. So, despite the dread churning in my gut, I went to the local police station near my new home. I expected the process to be painful, humiliating even, but ironically, it was fairly straightforward. Identity theft, especially among ex-spouses or close family members, had become disturbingly common. The officer who took my statement hardly blinked when he asked who I suspected was behind it, and I confessed it was my former wife. He typed diligently into the computer, pausing only to confirm addresses and read out my statements for accuracy. By the time the report was finalized, it felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders, at least in terms of doing the right thing for myself. But another, heavier weight descended, a sense of foreboding about Tiffany's reaction. Sure enough, I received an enraged phone call later that week. Tiffany's voice was high-pitched, laced with venom I'd only heard once or twice before. "You filed a police report?" she screeched, her words nearly incomprehensible. "What the hell were you thinking?" I tried to keep my composure. "I gave you a chance to fix this. You threatened me with withholding Daniel." She let out a sharp breath. "You think you'll see him again now?" she spat. "You really think the courts are going to side with you? You're harassing me. I can't believe you'd stoop this low accusing me of a crime." The phone call dissolved into shouting and tears. Tears that might have been genuine or might have been manipulated. I couldn't tell any. Finally, she hung up. I leaned on my kitchen counter, head pounding, my mind swirling with thoughts of how she was about to break the custody agreement. Indeed, over the next few weeks, she began refusing to let me pick Daniel up for my scheduled weekends. She claimed Daniel didn't feel well, or that he had a friend's birthday party, or that he had a project due. The excuses piled up, each more transparent than the last. What stung most was not being able to see my son. I worried he'd think I was simply failing to show up. I wanted to drive over there, but my attorney warned me that if she had half a mind, she would call the police with some excuse that I was trespassing or making threats. The only recourse was to keep documenting every instance of denied custody and compile it for court. And so, that's what I did. I noted every exchange in a journal, typed them into a spreadsheet, along with screenshots of text messages, missed calls, and emails. My heart broke each time I wrote down the reasons she refused to comply. But I knew that eventually, a judge would see the pattern. This wasn't in Daniel's best interests, let alone mine. About 3 months went by, and during that time, Tiffany barely let me see Daniel. I managed a brief video call or two, but always supervised by her, making it awkward and stilted. He clearly didn't understand what was going on, and I was careful not to trash-talk his mother. Instead, I just told him that I loved him, and was working on making sure everything was back to normal soon. Meanwhile, the police report I'd filed made its way into the system, and I waited for news about possible charges. To no one's surprise, I learned that the card companies typically do not pursue fraud claims against family members unless it's a large sum of money, or unless the victim, me, has some powerful legal push behind them. For now, the immediate victory was that both cards dropped from my credit report. My score bounced back up, and I set up a robust monitoring service that sent me alerts whenever someone tried to open new credit lines under my name. I remember calling the detective assigned to my case, a weary-sounding man in his 50s who had seen too many stories like mine. "Look," he said, "I get how frustrating this is, but the credit card companies just don't want to spend time and money chasing it, especially if they're already returning your credit to normal. If you want to press charges, you'll have to talk to the county prosecutor's office directly. But to be honest, they rarely take these cases unless it's a slam dunk with big financial damages." A combination of rage and helplessness washed over. At least my credit was safe, I told myself. That was one small victory, overshadowed by the heartbreak of my missing weekends with Daniel. The scheduled hearing took place several weeks later. As always, family court had that hushed, anxious atmosphere, a cluster of distressed parents, grandparents, children, and attorneys in the waiting. Tiffany arrived with an air of defiance. She wore a crisp suit, hair done up, posture rigid, her expression somewhere between confident and irritated. Her lawyer, a man I recognized from our divorce proceedings, also seemed unimpressed as he sized me up. I had my own attorney, a soft-spoken but relentless woman named Carly. We had mountains of documentation of Tiffany's refusal to let me see Daniel. I felt my nerves rattle as we made our arguments before the judge. That Tiffany had violated the existing custody order numerous times. That she had threatened to withhold Daniel from me if I filed a police report about fraud. Tiffany responded by painting me as manipulative, controlling, and a financial menace to her stability. She claimed I was a dangerous presence around Daniel. The judge pressed her for specifics, and Tiffany got flustered. Instead of real evidence, she offered hearsay. "He's unstable," she said, "and with all these accusations about credit cards, he's making it impossible for me to manage finances for Daniel's needs." My lawyer calmly produced the police report which stated that I was the victim. We produced copies of the credit card statements that were sent to Tiffany's address. The judge, a tired-looking middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, frowned at the documents. He noted that there was no official ongoing fraud case, but also that these statements clearly pointed to suspicious activity. Then he turned to Tiffany. "You realize this child custody arrangement is court-ordered," he said firmly. "If you continue to withhold visitation without a legally sanctioned reason, you could face contempt." Tiffany's gaze darted to her lawyer, but she said nothing. My heart hammered, part relief, part lingering worry. We all left the courtroom that day with a stern warning from the judge, but no immediate changes to custody. However, he did award me extra holiday time, doubling down on the arrangement from the divorce modifications. It was something, but I could sense Tiffany's fury. No matter how I tried to maintain a calm perspective, I knew we weren't done yet. I was right. Days after that hearing, Tiffany called me and demanded more money, specifically more child support and alimony. That alone took me aback because the divorce proceedings had settled the alimony portion, which ended altogether after a set period. Child support was formula-driven based on both our incomes. It wasn't as though I had a ton of extra money lying around. Between the mortgage, car payments, legal fees, and the everyday costs of living, I was stretched thin, though still comfortable enough to provide for Daniel's needs. "What do you mean you need more?" I asked, exasperated. "I can't keep up with expenses," she replied. "Daniel's going to need new clothes, new extracurriculars. If you want me to cooperate with the custody arrangement, you need to help more financially. That's all I'm saying." I tried to hide my anger. "This is extortion. If Daniel needs something, I'll pay direct, but I'm not giving you any extra cash on top of what I already owe in child support." She cut the call, and my stomach churned. I sensed that every exchange was a landmine. Sure enough, about a week later, I received an email alert from my new credit monitoring service. "A new account has been opened in your name." My gut twisted. The address, of course, was Tiffany's. At least this time, I managed to contact the lender the same day, shutting it down before it officially opened. The swirl of relief and fury was potent. She was so brazen about it. I added another entry to my log, another police report, another round of calls to the credit bureau. I froze my credit entirely to prevent any further attempts. Of course, I confronted Tiffany. She just responded with the same brand of defiance. "Prove it's me," she scoffed in a text message. "Maybe someone stole your identity again." I nearly lost my mind reading that, but I told myself to keep it together. For Daniel's sake, I had to remain rational. I filed the necessary paperwork and prepared for another lengthy hearing, certain I'd have to produce even more evidence and watch Tiffany try to slither her way out of any responsibility. But the turning point came sooner than expected. A few weeks after I filed the updated motion for custody enforcement. It was a Wednesday afternoon, a day that would become one of the most pivotal in my life. I was at work when my phone buzzed. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered out of habit, thinking it might be the credit monitoring service. To my shock, it was a representative from the state's Department of Children and Family Services. Mr. Garrison, the social worker said, voice tinged with concern. We have your son Daniel at the hospital for a checkup following a possible domestic situation. We need you to come down here. My heart lurched. Is he okay? I asked urgently, already on my feet, grabbing my coat from the back of my chair. He's stable, she assured me. He got a small injury to the side of his head, needed a couple of stitches. There was an altercation between your ex-wife and another adult male in the home. We believe Daniel was accidentally knocked into a piece of furniture. We just wanted to get him checked for a concussion. I was out the door before she'd even finished. My coworkers stared as I bolted, shouting a quick explanation that there was an emergency with my child. The drive to the hospital, usually congested with mid-afternoon traffic, passed in a haze. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. All I could see was Daniel's face in my mind, the many times I'd seen him scramble across the living room or the yard or the basketball. That energetic, unstoppable ball of sunshine now hurt. When I arrived, I practically ran into the emergency department. A nurse pointed me to a curtained area, where I found Daniel sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, his feet swinging anxiously. The moment he saw me, his eyes flooded with tears, and my own vision blurred instantly. I pulled him into a hug, so grateful he was conscious and able to stand and talk. The social worker introduced herself. Her name was Ms. Lopez, and explained the situation. Tiffany's new boyfriend had apparently moved in recently, and they argued often. That night, the argument escalated into a physical fight, and Daniel was caught in the crossfire, literally. He'd been standing too close when the boyfriend shoved Tiffany. She stumbled backward into Daniel, who toppled over the coffee table, slicing open the side of his head on the corner. A wave of anger and protectiveness roared through me. Daniel had never mentioned any of this to me. He was such a loyal kid, likely trying not to cause trouble. Ms. Lopez said that Tiffany and her boyfriend were taken in by the police for a short while, but released the next day. It didn't appear that any formal charges were being filed for the domestic incident, as neither adult seemed eager to press charges, nor were there obvious injuries beyond Daniel's cut. What stunned me most was that Daniel looked up at me with tearful eyes and said, "Dad, I don't want to live there anymore. I'm scared of Mom's boyfriend." I hugged him again, my throat clogged with emotion I could barely contain. Ms. Lopez gently explained that they were working on a safety plan and wanted to know if I could assume full-time care of Daniel until the next scheduled court date, since the courts had already flagged Tiffany for prior violations of custody and a possible risk of identity fraud. She said it was well within the state's guidelines to place Daniel with me immediately, at least in the short term. "Yes," I blurted immediately, relief welling in me like a flood. I had fought so long and so hard, only to be stonewalled at every turn. Yet here was the Child Protection Agency effectively handing me custody. It felt surreal, overshadowed by sadness that Daniel had to get hurt for this to happen. Before we left, Daniel underwent one final checkup. The nurse said his stitches would be removed in about a week. I thanked them repeatedly. We drove home in silence. He looked so small in the passenger seat, biting his lip, gazing out the window. Once we got to my house, my new wife, yes, I'd remarried some time back, rushed out, tears in her eyes, hugging Daniel like he was her own. She had been an unwavering pillar of support through this entire ordeal, but it felt like our home wasn't quite complete without Daniel around more often. And now, ironically under these dire circumstances, he was home to stay, at least temporarily. Over the next few days, I contacted the school. They granted Daniel a special pass so that Tiffany wasn't allowed to pick him up without prior authorization. She attempted once, the very next week, but the staff refused to release him, citing the ongoing custody dispute and the pending protective measures. I got a call from the principal, who quietly confirmed that Tiffany had come by, demanded Daniel, and left when they threatened to call campus police. The following week, we had another court date, one that had been scheduled to address Tiffany's repeated violations of the old custody order. However, everything had drastically changed with the domestic incident. This time, Tiffany actually failed to show up, perhaps out of fear she'd be reprimanded, or that the judge would question her about the identity theft. Regardless, the judge granted my petition for a major alteration of custody, giving me primary physical custody with Tiffany receiving visitation. The next hearing, set a few weeks later, was Tiffany's chance to contest this new arrangement, but she never arrived for that one either. The judge, seemingly exasperated, finalized the new custody order. In a single stroke, all those years of struggling just to see Daniel consistently ended with a new order naming me as the custodial parent. He was officially staying with me. The swirl of joy, relief, and heartbreak was overwhelming. I wished we could have reached this point without Daniel ever being hurt. Yet it wasn't all sunshine. Part of me felt strangely guilty. I had longed for 50-50 custody or even primary custody for so long, but I never wanted it to happen at the cost of Daniel being traumatized or physically harmed. Still, I focused on the present reality. He was safe, living in a stable environment, and no longer subject to Tiffany's manipulations every single day. There was one final matter to address: the ongoing identity theft. One would think that by now, with Tiffany's pattern of opening new accounts in my name, including one I caught before it was finalized, some legal entity would intervene. But it became painfully clear that the local prosecutors had zero interest in pursuing fraud charges against her, especially given that the credit card companies had removed those accounts from my reports. My attorney explained that pressing forward with criminal charges could cost me tens of thousands in legal fees, with no guarantee of a conviction. She suggested focusing on protecting Dan, preserving my own credit, and letting go of the criminal pursuit for my own mental health. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I tried to accept it. At least the immediate crises were over. Daniel was with me and my credit was safe. The rest, I decided, was up to fate, or to Tiffany's eventual misfortune if she tried to defraud someone else. Over the next few months, the emotional roller coaster slowed, though it never really stopped. Daniel enrolled fully in my local district. I drove him to school in the morning, and we bonded during those 30-minute commutes. He'd talk about how weird it felt not to see his mom every day. I encouraged him to keep some contact with her if he wished, but we also agreed that, for now, he felt safer without going to her apartment. Occasionally, Tiffany texted me or emailed, often switching between guilt-tripping and demanding money. "You took my son away from me," she'd accuse. "I can't believe you're this heartless. He should be with his mother." Her logic made no sense, given that she had refused to let me see him for months and effectively forced the court's hand. I explained, time and again, that she was free to arrange supervised visitation or any arrangement the court approved, but that I wouldn't let her just whisk him away whenever she felt like it. Besides, Daniel needed consistency. He was still healing from the fight he witnessed and the injury he suffered. The anger in Tiffany's messages soon turned into total radio silence. No phone calls, no attempts at visitation, just emptiness. Daniel tried to text her a couple of times, but she rarely answered. I watched that heartbreak flicker in his eyes each time he looked at his phone, hoping for a reply, only to face silence. My wife and I stepped in as best we could, showering him with attention, going on family outings, ensuring he knew he was loved. Over time, Daniel softened, that tension in his shoulders easing. He started bringing friends over. We turned the spare room into a gaming space for him. He joked about how much he loved having a yard, especially after living in an apartment with no place to run around. I discovered, to my delight, that he had a knack for basketball. We'd shoot hoops for hours on weekends, sweat pouring off us, exchanging teasing banter. There were nights, of course, when he'd have trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of that violent scuffle. I'd sit by his bed until he drifted off again. Bit by bit, we built a routine, one where he was safe, stable, and not subject to the unpredictability of Tiffany's moods. Months turned into a year, then a bit more. During that time, the courts had all but closed the active case, finalizing the custody arrangement in my favor. Tiffany's identity theft never led to any convictions, and eventually the county sent a final letter stating they would not prosecute. I accepted this outcome, albeit with a certain bitterness. But as Carly, my attorney, had advised, it was best to let go of the criminal fight and focus on the life Daniel and I were building. In the end, Tiffany's threats, manipulations, and fraudulent activities served to push Daniel away from her rather than create the wedge between him and me that she'd intended. She attempted a final power play when Daniel turned 13, a sudden petition demanding child support from me, claiming she was the rightful custodian and that the new custody order had been forced on her. The judge dismissed her motion swiftly, pointing out that not only had she failed to appear for prior hearings, but Daniel was already living primarily with me, per the official order. That fiasco ended with Tiffany storming out of the courtroom, eyes blazing. I haven't heard about any new credit card fiascos since. Daniel is about to turn 14 now. He's thriving as far as I can tell, playing basketball at school, doing reasonably well in his classes, chatting excitedly about his new group of friends. Sometimes I see flickers of sadness, especially on days he tries to call his mom and gets no answer. He's old enough to know that her side of the story is complicated. I never encourage him to hate her. Instead, I remind him that if she's ready to rebuild her relationship with him in a healthy way, I will support it. As for me, I'm working on letting go of the anger. It comes in waves, especially when I see reminders of how easy it is for some people to exploit the system. But I'm comforted by the knowledge that I provided a safe, loving home for Daniel, and that no matter how ugly things got, I never stopped trying to do right by him. Tiffany tried to withhold him, tried to ruin me financially, and even threatened me with more false claims. But in the end, it was her own reckless, destructive behavior that turned the tides so completely. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if she'd just approached me about needing more money instead of forging my name. Even if I didn't have spare cash lying around, maybe we could have worked out some arrangement for Daniel's expenses. But by crossing that line, opening accounts in my name, lying to me, and then threatening to withhold my son if I didn't turn a blind eye, she severed any trust we might have still shared. Now, she's on the outside, missing out on Daniel's day-to-day life, and I'm left to pick up the pieces of her choices. In a perfect world, we'd sit down with our new partners, and Daniel would have the benefit of two healthy co-parents, plus two supportive step-parents. But life isn't perfect, and sometimes all we can do is celebrate the small triumphs. For me, that triumph is my son's well-being. He's safe, he's happy, and ironically enough, I'm finally in the position I always wanted, to care for him full-time, to watch him grow into a teenager, and eventually a young man. While no criminal justice system intervention ever truly materialized against Tiffany's fraudulent actions, everything else eventually fell into place for Daniel. The judge gave me custody, Daniel felt secure, and Tiffany's manipulations gradually ceased to have power over us. It's not the happy ending I had imagined on my wedding day all those years ago, but it's the best resolution we could hope for after all that happened. Above all else, it's a testament to the fact that if you stand up for yourself, document every wrongdoing, protect yourself legally, and keep your child's best interest at heart, you can survive even the worst your ex throws at you. Sometimes it might take a heavy toll financially and emotionally, but every mile I drive Daniel to school, every game we play together, every bedtime story or basketball match we share, those are priceless moments that make it all worthwhile. Maybe Tiffany will straighten out one day. Maybe she'll see that Daniel deserves both his parents, free from the toxicity of old grudges and new manipulations. I hope that's the case. But if not, I've learned I can't fix her problems. Only Daniel's and mine. And for now, that's enough. We're a family, healing and growing, and no stack of fraudulent credit cards can ever take that away. Even in the more peaceful periods that followed, I found myself haunted by small reminders of the storm we had weathered. Occasionally, I'd open my mailbox and feel my stomach knot, worried I'd see another suspicious bill. It took me weeks to stop flinching every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number. But step by step, day by day, I regained my confidence. I enrolled Daniel in a weekend basketball league, and my wife and I spent countless hours in the bleachers, cheering him on. The shift in his demeanor was dramatic. Gone was the anxious, uncertain boy, overshadowed by fear of his mother's boyfriend, replaced by a more exuberant kid who finally felt free to explore his interests without constantly walking on eggshells. Sometimes Daniel asked gentle questions about what had happened with his mom. He wondered if she'd truly stolen my identity, if that was something grown-ups did when they were desperate. All I could do was be honest. Yes, she'd opened accounts in my name. Yes, it had hurt me financially and emotionally, but I tried to frame it in a way that emphasized that people can make bad choices when they feel cornered or afraid, and that it didn't mean his mother didn't care for him in her own way. I had to walk a fine line between truth and compassion. Daniel deserved honesty, but I also didn't want to poison him against his mom. In time, he stopped asking. I think he started seeing for himself that his mother's life choices were out of his control, and that he was happiest focusing on the security of the home we had created for him. My wife, who initially struggled with feeling like a secondary figure, found that Daniel warmed up to her more than ever once he lived with us full-time. She helped him decorate his room, choose paint colors, and set up his game console. They baked cookies together on random Saturday afternoons, filling the house with the smell of fresh dough and chocolate chips. I often stood by the kitchen doorway, watching them with a mixture of pride and profound gratitude that I'd found someone capable of loving Daniel with a gentle maternal warmth he wasn't always getting from his biological mother. I wish I could say Tiffany recognized the damage she'd done and sought to repair her relationship with our son, but mostly she stayed distant, making a show of wanting more money, then falling silent when I refused. Occasionally, I heard from mutual acquaintances that her boyfriend had moved out, then back in, then out again. There were rumors of arguments, of job instability, of her complaining about the unfairness of the custody arrangement. But from where I stood, it was she who had forced the court's hand. I tried not to dwell on it too much. We had come too far to let her decisions define our everyday lives. Perhaps my greatest comfort throughout this journey was seeing how resilient Daniel was. He didn't become bitter or angry at the world. Instead, he channeled his experiences into a quiet empathy for others. He once told me about a friend at school whose parents were divorcing, and how he'd tried to reassure him that life goes on, that it's not the end of the world. Hearing Daniel speak those words made me realize how much he had grown from that scared little boy who used to cling to my sleeve, frightened of the next upheaval. That's when I truly knew we had turned a corner. Eventually, there came a point when the memory of rushing to the hospital, the bruising fear in my gut, and the long nights agonizing over fraudulent credit accounts started to fade. It didn't disappear entirely, trauma rarely does, but it found a quieter place in my mind, overshadowed by day-to-day concerns like Daniel's homework, scheduling dentist appointments, and planning our next vacation. I began feeling free to envision a future where Daniel would graduate from high school in a few years, possibly attend college, or pursue whatever dream ignited his passion. As for Tiffany, I held on to a sliver of hope that one day she might straighten out her life enough to be a stable presence for Daniel. But in the meantime, I would protect him from any more chaos. All in all, while the road we took was full of twists, heartbreak, and stressful battles in court, I can confidently say that the outcome was one I can live with. Daniel is safe, healthy, and flourishing, and I've reclaimed my sense of financial stability, plus the knowledge that I have all the documentation and processes in place to prevent a repeat of Tiffany's credit schemes. The most important lesson I learned was about the power of perseverance. Sometimes the system feels stacked against you, and the people you once trusted can turn on you. But if you keep detailed records, persist through legal avenues, and never lose sight of what truly matters, like the well-being of your child, victory, however bittersweet, can be achieved. I wish I could say justice was served in the way we see on television, with Tiffany facing criminal charges for identity theft and learning a hard lesson. But the real world rarely operates so cleanly. Instead, life delivered its own brand of consequences. She lost the custody arrangement she had once wielded as leverage, and she damaged her own bond with our son. The court recognized her pattern of manipulation, and Daniel himself saw who was there for him when it mattered the most. Today, as I watch Daniel sprint across the basketball court, I feel an almost overwhelming surge of pride and relief. The scars of the past still exist, but they've hardened into something that reminds me of how far we've come, rather than something that holds us back. I'm incredibly grateful we reached a place of genuine peace. If there's any wisdom to be gleaned from my story, it's this. Don't let fear of retaliation stop you from standing up for your rights and your child's well-being. Document everything. Seek professional legal advice. Do what you must to protect yourself financially, physically, and emotionally. And remember that, in the end, it's the child's safety and security that matters most, not winning some arbitrary war of pride or revenge. That's how we made it through, and how I found a life far more stable and fulfilling than I ever thought possible in the darkest days of the divorce. Now Daniel and I look ahead. He talks about trying out for the varsity basketball team when he reaches high school, and I've made an unspoken promise to stand in those stands for every game he plays. We're savoring the everyday, from post-practice burgers to late-night study sessions for his algebra exams. The shadow of Tiffany's threats and intimidation no longer looms over us, and while we both wish things had unfolded differently, we know we can handle anything that comes our way. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and we're determined to make the most. Most importantly, it's a home filled with trust, something that no amount of fraudulent credit cards or intimidation tactics could destroy. In the grand scheme of things, I consider that a remarkable triumph, and one Daniel will carry with him as he grows, forging his own path free from the errors of the past.